Oh yeah, baby. Oh yeah, baby. You didn't die, my friend. You're not in heaven. You're just on the Clark the Shark show. But basically, for the next 20, 30 minutes or so, you're going to be in heaven. Because you're going to hear the golden tones, the most amazing talk radio voice of Clark the Shark at 1-800-449-8255, coming to you from the golden EIB Sharkraphone. And of course, I'm here today to talk about just one of the greatest albums ever recorded in rock and roll, progressive rock, whatever you want to call it. We're talking about Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Peter Gabriel, the masterpiece album. And of course, right after this album, this tour, Peter Gabriel would leave the band. And in Torrance and Redondo Beach and, the South Bay, Los Angeles, we were all in shock because this guy just wrote the story of this guy, Rail. People around the South Bay would go spray paint Rail. And we love this story, man. And of course, Peter Gabriel got the idea from The Who on the Who Sell Out Rail. And he created a whole rock opera. Kind of like The Who would do, man. Kind of like The Who Quadrophenia. But I consider this album Genesis's Quadrophenia, man. With Peter Gabriel coming up with the character Rail. He's kind of like Jimmy from Quadrophenia for this album. This amazing, incredible album from 1974. But I think of this as 1975, that tour with Genesis, and Peter Gabriel was still in the band in 1975 for the tour. And I'm not sure if the fans and the crowds at the gigs knew. I can't remember if Genesis was keeping it quiet or if it was common knowledge that Peter was quitting, but when it became official that Peter Gabriel was out of Genesis, it was the most sad thing, man. In the South Bay and Torrance, we all cried. I'm still crying now, man. Because to me, Genesis is just Peter Gabriel solo. And the guys like Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford and Phil Collins and the amazing, great Steve Hackett on guitar. These were Pete's backing band. But it isn't the case. Genesis really was a democracy. These guys all wrote the songs by committee. And even Steve Hackett learned the hard way. It's all by committee in Genesis. And Steve Hackett would quit the band after Wind and Wuthering. He wasn't on, and then there were three, which is such an amazing album. It's really the last great album by Genesis, if you want the truth. I love And Then There Were Three, and I love Wind and Wuthering. And of course, A Trick of the Tail is basically just real Genesis in my book. It's almost like Peter Gabriel is on A Trick of the Tail. But we're not talking about any of those albums. No, sir. Here at the Clark the Shark Show today at 1-800-449-8255, we're going to talk about The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Genesis, 1974. The final album with Peter Gabriel. And what an amazing, incredible album this is. Oh, this album, Genesis. The Lamb Lies Down. And the tour after it. Incredible. Atmospheres, moods, were all captured on this album. The story of Rail. And then, of course, Peter Gabriel dressed up like Rail for the tour. And they tried so hard. Oh, Oxford, it's recorded here. There's, there's always a story about Surrey or Oxford where Genesis recorded. I don't even know. I don't even care where they recorded it, man. Broadway, where Rail roamed, he dwelled. Rail, man, the lead character for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, yeah, man, it's all important to the story. It's all important. Oh, Brian Eno. He played a role on this album, man. I love Roxy music. This album, I think it's just the first album, Brian Eno. He's a story unto himself. And of course it gets 5 stars, but every review for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, with Peter Gabriel and Genesis, the most amazing British prog rock musicians, always should get 5 stars, baby. You don't give The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway 4 stars, no way. You're on the Clark the Shark show, man, it's 5-star reviews only, baby. And this album starts out, side 1 is amazing. The song, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, is just this incredible Banks and Gabriel. And Fly on a Windshield is just so dark. It's so dark. Rutherford and Banks wrote the music. All the lyrics are written by Peter Gabriel. He did nothing. But on this album, he did everything. When they interview Peter Gabriel, he's like, I did nothing. I'm like, Pete, you did everything on this album, in my view. I don't care if Rutherford and Banks and Hackett and Phil wrote the songs. Broadway Melody of 1974 is incredible. The music is just so incredible. All the atmospheres and the dark, evil tone of Rail is just captured. It's so dark, evil. This album isn't underground. This is commercial. This album seems like the biggest, greatest album of the 1970s. But really, it didn't sell that well. It's a shock to me. Clock the Shock Show. It's a shock. It's a surprise. I expected Genesis to be so much bigger with this album. And when I was a little kid, just 9, 10, 11 years old, 1974, 75, 76, at Newton School, Parkway School in Torrance, when I was just a kid, we all loved this album from the UK. And Cocoon. Oh, it's great. Of course, my favorite song on the amazing side 1 is In the Cage. In the Cage! Ah! Gabriel's just so great on In the Cage. And the Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging is just like the funny little... This is a funny little song by Tony Banks, but Peter's writing the words. Now, side 2 goes to another level because I love Back in New York City, A Hairless Heart. And Counting Out Time is just so funny, it's just so irreverent. And of course, The Carpet Crawlers, one of the greatest Genesis songs. And The Chamber of 32 Doors is just fucking awesome, man. Side 2 goes to another level from side 1, but side 1 is amazing. And after you have listened to side 1 and side 2, you're convinced you're listening to one of the greatest albums of all time. Not just by Genesis, but this goes right there with the Who Quadrophenia. And Pete's like, no. I'm like, sorry, Pete. For Lily White Lilith, In the Waiting Room. And I love Anyway, man. Oh, I love it. Here comes the supernatural anesthesiast, or like honest atheist. It's like it's about Frank Zappa. I don't even know. But the Lamia, the silent sorrow in empty boats. And you can just feel that Rutherford and Banks and Hackett They have to go into the other room and write something dark and brooding and evil and atmospheric, and catching all the dark atmosphere that Peter Gabriel is writing the dark lyrics. And this album catches everything so perfectly. The Lamb Lies Down. You just feel like you're in a futuristic Stephen King, like 1984 George Orwell. It's such a dark, brave new world. And Rail is this character like Jimmy from Quadrophenia, but he's darker, and he's writing on all the walls. Rail, Imperial, Emerson Kid, hides his spray gun, forgotten what he did, and the lamb lies down on Broadway. It's just so incredible, this album. You talk about that album that would get 6 stars out of 5 stars, it's this one. And the Colony of Slippermen. Genesis goes to a level where they never achieved another album this great. No way. I mean, I love A Trick of the Tail, but it is not The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This album's incredible. I mean, and Ravine and The Light Lies Down on Broadway. It's like a reprise. Like something The Who or the Beatles on Sgt. Pepper would do. Paul's like, I don't like this album, Clark the Shark. I think I'm going to get a lawyer and I'm going to sue Peter Gabriel for quitting the band and stealing all my ideas from Sgt. Pepper. And I'm like, Paul McCartney, go get a lawyer. You can sue the Ruddles. You can sue Neil Innes, and you can sue Peter Gabriel. Paul, I don't care who you sue. You can sue Michael Jackson. You can even bloody sue yourself. Oh, I accidentally sued myself. Paul's so fucked up, man. He'll try to sue anybody. But I don't even care, because I love Genesis. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Riding the Scree. And in the Rapids. And if there's one song I kind of don't like, it's It. It just seems like such, I don't know, atypical 70s rock. But I even like it. I like it all. You know, Genesis they're doing something here with this album. The amazing Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Every song is incredible on this album, and I want you to go buy this album right now, where Peter Gabriel says farewell to Genesis. And he never came back to the band except for 1978 and 1982, where they did the one album in the rain. It wasn't an album, it was just a live show. But everyone who was there said it was so incredible. Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I would love to see these guys come back in 2023 or 2024 and tour and play The Lamb. I know Phil can't play. Phil's in a wheelchair. He can hardly walk. He's old. He's like Barry Gibb in a wheelchair. They might have to amputate his legs. Oh, bloody hell. We're all getting old. But I would love to see Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks, and Mike Rutherford, and Steve Hackett get together. Maybe with Daryl Sturmer, Chester Thompson. I know Phil doesn't want him to play, but I'd love to see him do an album, man. In 2023 or 2024 or 2025. Peter Gabriel with Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. Phil's gone. Phil's going to be leaving us soon. But it shouldn't stop Genesis from one more tour, one more album. Maybe play The Lamb. The fabulous Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The story of Rail. This character who's just so disillusioned and writing his name all over New York City because he wants to be remembered. So do I, Clark the Shark. And Frank Zappa's like, I don't care if they remember me. I'm like, Frank, we're going to remember you, man. We're going to get a grave marker for Frank Zappa. And Dweezil Zappa's going to listen to me. And Moon Unit, you're going to listen to me, Clark the Shark, at 1-800-449-8255. And we're going to get a grave marker out there in Los Angeles for Frank Zappa at his grave. But I even want a grave for Rail. This guy. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Peter Gabriel wrote all the lyrics to this album. And Genesis, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford and Steve Hackett, they wrote all the dark, brooding music that goes perfectly with the lyrics from Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel's swan song where he says adios and goodbye to Genesis. But he wrote an amazing story. Just an album that I grew up with from the time I was 10, 11 years old in Redondo Beach in Torrance. And me and my brother Paul, we loved this album, man. When I got in the Greenhouse Effect, I wanted to write dark, mysterious lyrics like Peter Gabriel, but, I tried and I wrote some fucking great shit, but it's nowhere near as great as Peter Gabriel and this album. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It captures atmosphere. It captures a mood. It captures a dark moment. It's better than the Who Quadrophenia, man. Maybe they're equal. I love Jimmy, but I love Rail. Man, I love the story of Rail. I love this album. I'm so bummed out that Peter Gabriel left the band. I love A Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering, but I always wonder, what would have Genesis been like with Peter Gabriel coming back to the fold and recording one more album with Genesis in England? I wonder, man, what would Peter Gabriel and Genesis have sounded like if they did one or two more albums along the way somewhere in the 1980s, 1990s, late 1970s, 2000s. I would love to hear Peter Gabriel come back to the fold, Pete, and play with these guys, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. All of them in the band, in the fold. Return to the fold. Peter, return to Genesis and tour, play the Lamb. And write a new Lamb, I swear, you guys. Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Pete, and Steve Hackett. The four of you shall record again and tour again. Clark the Shark has to see it happen. Even if Phil can't play and he's in a wheelchair. Phil, you gotta let go of Genesis and you gotta let these four guys record an album and tour without you, mate. I want to hear The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway Part 2. I really do want to hear it. Clark the Shark has got to hear Peter Gabriel get back with Genesis. It would be so amazing. And because I remember my youth when I was little and listening to this album, I couldn't even figure out the story of Rail. But I knew he was a dark, brooding misfit. He was confused, just like Jimmy from Quadrophenia and the U, and Pete Townsend. But somehow Peter Gabriel got more intrinsic, more like mysterious, darker, brooding. And this music captures the atmosphere so perfectly on the Clark the Shark Show at 1-800-449-8255. The Clark the Shark Show, the Wolfman Jack on crack. I'm coming to you from the golden EIB Sharkraphone. It's not a microphone, people. It's a Sharkraphone. And you're with me as I review Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Probably the most amazing, incredible album ever recorded by any rock band, any prog rock band. I don't care, man. When you add Peter Gabriel to Genesis, you have the most incredible music. Selling England by the Pound and Foxtrot, where the dogs are trying to catch the fox. We're all trying to catch that fox. All of us were all trying to catch the fox. At 1-800-449-8255. But maybe we never will. But we'll catch Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This is probably my favorite album ever recorded. And most people will agree, in the top 1,000 albums, this is in the top 10, man, of greatest albums ever recorded. Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, with Peter Gabriel and all the guys in the fold. The amazing Tony Banks on keyboards. Tony Banks is so amazing. And Mike Rutherford's bass. And Steve Hackett, the most amazing guitar player. And the drumming by Phil Collins on this album is incredible. You put all these five guys together, and they hit it out of the park on this album. This is a home run, and that ball is gone. It's in the river. You can't even autograph the ball because it's gone. The amazing five guys in Genesis. Incredible, great musicians. Talking about this guy, this faceless, nameless rail. But he wants to be remembered. It's like being electrocuted. But he's going to spray paint his name on the walls of New York City. He's like, help me! I'm Rail! Don't forget me! And he's like, now I'm being electrocuted! And he's just looking at himself. He's like Uriah Heep, just look at yourself. And he's just nameless and faceless. And Peter Gabriel just wrote a story about Rail. And this is really the story, people, about all of you and me. Like the Who, Quadrophenia, from Pete. Almost like Frank Zappa, Freak Out. Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This album is a cut above everything, and I want you to go buy it, people, at Spotify, Amazon, iTunes. I want you to buy Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It just captures a dark, moody atmosphere.